You are no longer my wife. 6 words. In front of 20 people. After 6 years of Elizabeth Whitmore building, protecting, and quietly saving everything Alexander Whitmore believed he had built alone. She did not cry. She did not beg. She picked up the pen, her hand perfectly steady, and she signed her name. Not his name. Her name. And then she walked out of that grand hall carrying a secret that would have saved him. A secret she chose to use anyway. Not for him, but because it was right. If you've ever given everything to someone who never truly saw you stay until the very end. Subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1817 in Virginia came in hot, and certain the kind of heat that pressed against everything and left no room for pretending. It was the kind of summer that stripped things down to what they actually were, not what people said about them in drawing rooms, not what was written in letters meant to be read aloud at dinner, not what was performed in church pews on Sunday mornings. Just the truth of things bare and uncomfortable and unavoidable. Elizabeth Whitmore had known this particular truth for 3 months. She had known it the way women of her era knew most important things, not through direct conversation, not through honest declaration, but through the accumulation of small signals that each one meant nothing, and together meant everything. The way Alexander's eyes moved past her at breakfast. The way he answered her questions about the estate accounts with the particular brevity of someone who has decided the person asking doesn't need the full answer. The way he stopped asking her opinion and then stopped noticing that he had stopped. She had known. She had not said anything. She had gone on managing the household, reviewing the accounts corresponding with the estate's creditors, in the careful, oblique way that a woman of her position managed such things, never directly, always through the language of suggestion and quiet correction. Never letting the men who received her instructions understand that the instructions were hers. She had done all of this and said nothing about what she knew was coming. Because Elizabeth Whitmore had learned over 6 years of marriage to Alexander Whitmore that the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could do was show her hand before the other player showed his. She was waiting. And then, the morning of July the 14th arrived, and Thomas, the house steward, a man who had worked for the Whitmore family since before Alexander was born, and who had the particular unhappy expression of someone carrying a message they wished they didn't have, knocked on the door of her sitting room and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore requests your presence in the Grand Hall at 2 o'clock. Elizabeth looked at him. Thomas looked at the floor. "There will be guests present," he said. He said it carefully, which told her everything. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "I'll be there." He left. She set down the letter she had been writing, a response to the family solicitor about an irregularity in the quarterly accounts. The third such irregularity in 8 months, the kind of pattern that meant something specific if you knew how to read it, and she folded it and put it in the drawer of her writing desk and turned the small brass key. She locked it. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she stood up and went to dress for 2 o'clock. She chose the gray dress. Her maid Caroline had laid out the blue one, the one with the ivory trim that Alexander had once said made her look exactly as a wife of the Whitmore name should look. Caroline was young and loyal and did not understand yet that the blue dress was the wrong choice for this particular afternoon. "The gray one," Elizabeth said. Caroline hesitated. "Ma'am, it's the gray is for—" "I know what the gray is for," Elizabeth said. "The gray, please." Caroline helped her dress without further comment, though her hands were slightly less steady than usual, which told Elizabeth that the servants' quarters already knew what 2 o'clock was for. Word moved through a house like this the way water moved through old stone, through every crack, finding every level, reaching everywhere before anyone officially said a thing. When Elizabeth looked at herself in the glass, she thought good, not beautiful, not deliberately appealing, just clear. The gray dress was the color of someone who has decided something and is no longer asking for approval about it. She went downstairs at 1 minute to 2. 20 people were in the grand hall. She had expected perhaps 8, the closest family friends, the neighbors whose opinions Alexander cared about most. 20 was deliberate. 20 was a statement. 20 people meant that whatever was about to happen was intended to be witnessed at a scale that made it permanent, that made it the kind of thing that would be discussed over dinner tables for the next decade. She understood immediately. This was not a private ending. This was a public one. She walked in the way her mother had taught her to walk into rooms with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands still at her sides, because a woman who controlled her body controlled the narrative of how she was perceived, and controlling the narrative was sometimes the only power available to her. The 20 people watched her cross the room. She looked at none of them. She looked at Alexander. He was standing beside the fireplace, not in front of it, not with the commanding posture of a man making a grand announcement, but beside it, slightly turned away, as if he had been looking at something in the fire and had only just turned when she entered. He was wearing his good coat. His hair was neat. He looked, she thought, exactly like himself, handsome and composed, and absolutely certain, which were the three qualities he had always carried in this room as comfortably as other men carried their pocket watches. The sealed document was on the table between them. She had seen documents like this before. Her father had been a solicitor for 30 years before his health failed. She knew what a document sealed in that particular way, on that particular paper, with that particular wax. She knew what it was before she was close enough to read it. She stopped on her side of the table. Alexander looked at her. He did not say my wife. He said Elizabeth, just her name, precise and clean, like something that had been cut to fit a specific space. Alexander, she said. The room around them had the particular silence of people who are pretending not to listen while listening with everything they have. I have decided to end this marriage, he said. He said it the way he said most things, with the steady, unhurried confidence of a man who has rehearsed something enough that it no longer felt like a rehearsal. No hesitation, no visible regret. The declaration of a man who had arrived at a conclusion and was now simply announcing it. Elizabeth looked at him. She did not cry. She had made that decision at the writing desk with her hands flat and the solicitor's letter locked in the drawer. She had decided that she would not cry in this room in front of these people for this man today. Not because the tears weren't there. They were there. They had been there for months, waiting in the particular place where women of her time and her position stored things that weren't safe to feel completely. She simply did not allow them to come. What is the reason? She said. The room shifted. She heard it, the small collective breath of 20 people who had expected something other than that. They had expected perhaps tears, protest, the theatrical grief of a wife being publicly set aside. They had not expected a direct question delivered in a level voice. Alexander's composure fractured very slightly for just a moment, the way ice fractures before it shows the crack fully. She saw it, and she filed it away, because in this room on this afternoon, every piece of information was significant. The marriage has failed, he said. We are not suited. It has become clear over time that we do not complement each other in the ways that a marriage of this family requires. It was a careful answer, legal in its precision, personal in none of the ways that mattered. She understood what he meant beneath it because she had understood it for months. She had not given him the right kind of wife, which meant she had not stayed sufficiently in the background, had not performed sufficient ignorance of the estate's workings, had not restricted herself to the decorative functions that the men who moved through the Whitmore social world expected of a Whitmore wife. She had been too competent in the ways that women weren't supposed to be competent, and too silent about it, and the silence had eventually read to Alexander as something other than discretion. It had read as distance. She had been trying to protect him. He had experienced it as a kind of reproach. She understood now that she had never fully explained the difference, and that the failure to explain it was the thing, not the thing itself, but the explanation that had cost her everything. I see, she said. She reached for the document. 20 people watched her hands. Her hands were steady. She had decided they would be steady, and so they were. Because Elizabeth Whitmore was, among other things, a woman who had spent 6 years deciding what she would and would not allow the world to see, and she was not going to stop now. She read every line. It took 4 minutes. She did not rush. The 20 people in the room waited through 4 minutes of silence while she read a document that ended her marriage. And she read it completely, because whatever else was true, she was not going to sign something she hadn't read. When she finished, she looked up at Alexander. "The estate provisions here," she said, "are consistent with the settlement terms my father's solicitor outlined when we married." Alexander blinked. "Yes. The timeline for my removal from the house is—" She checked the document, 30 days. "Yes." "And the Whitmore name?" she said. "I'll return to Hargrove." "That would be yes," Alexander said. He seemed slightly off balance, she noticed, in the way that people go off balance when the conversation they planned is happening in a shape they didn't plan it in. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. Elizabeth Hargrove, she wrote, because she was already becoming who she was going to be next. She set down the pen. She looked at the man who had been her husband for 6 years, and who was looking at her now with the expression she would think about for months afterward, not relieved, not satisfied, but something that was adjacent to confused, as if she had answered a question he hadn't asked, and not answered the one he had. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Alexander," she said. She meant it. That was the part nobody in the room expected. She could hear it in the silence, in the particular quality of the collective attention of 20 people who had anticipated grief or anger and were receiving something they didn't have a category for. She meant it with the full, clear, uncomplicated sincerity of a woman who had loved a man and wanted good things for him, even as she understood that this was over. She turned and walked out of the grand hall. She did not look back. Caroline was waiting at the top of the stairs. The girl's face was a complicated landscape of things she was trying not to show: grief primarily, and the particular helplessness of someone who cares about a person and has no available action to take. "Ma'am," she said. "Pack what's mine," Elizabeth said. "Not the Whitmore pieces. Not the household items. What's actually mine." "Yes, ma'am." Caroline's voice was very controlled. "Where are we going?" "We." Elizabeth noticed that. She noticed it and felt it in the part of herself she was keeping locked today, the part with the tears in it. "Hargrove House," she said. "My grandfather's estate." She started down the hall toward her rooms. "Caroline, I need you to do something for me before we start packing." "Anything, ma'am?" "Go to the library. Bottom shelf left side. There is a green ledger. It says Household Accounts 1814 on the spine. Bring it to me. Don't let anyone see you take it." Caroline looked at her. "Just that one?" "And the 3 behind it," Elizabeth said. "The ones for 1815, 1816, and 1817. Caroline looked at her with the expression of a young woman who is beginning to understand that there are things happening in this house that she has not fully understood. "Yes, ma'am," she said and went. Thomas found her 20 minutes later. She was in her sitting room, the gray dress still on, sitting at the writing desk with the brass-keyed drawer open, reviewing the letter to the solicitor that she had put away before 2 o'clock. She had it open now and was reading it in the way she read everything important, completely slowly, marking what mattered with a precise memory that had served her far better than anyone in this house had ever known. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said. "Miss Hargrove," she said without looking up. "As of 2 o'clock. Thomas absorbed this. "Miss Hargrove," he said. His voice was different when he said it, not corrected but respectful in a new way, like something had shifted in the order of things, and he was adjusting. "What is it, Thomas?" "Mr. Whitmore would like to know if you require assistance with the arrangements," he said. He paused, "for your departure." She looked up from the letter. She looked at Thomas, who had been in this house since before Alexander was born, who knew where every body was buried financially, and otherwise who had watched this marriage with the quiet attention of a man who understood more about what was happening in the house than anyone suspected. "Tell Mr. Whitmore that I'll manage my own arrangements," she said. "I always have." Thomas looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not grief, not the formal sympathy of a servant. Something older and more honest than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who has watched something happen slowly over a long time and is now watching it come to its conclusion. "Yes, Miss Hargrove," he said. He started to leave. "Thomas." He stopped. She hesitated for a moment. "The accounts?" she said. "The quarterly statements from Aldridge and Sons going back to 1815. Are they still in the estate office?" Thomas looked at her carefully. "They are," he said. "And the correspondence with the London creditors?" "In the lower cabinet," he said. "The locked one." She looked at him. "You know where Mr. Whitmore keeps the key?" It was not a question. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was making a calculation. She could see him making it, the particular interior arithmetic of a loyal servant, deciding where his loyalty actually resided. "I do," he said finally. "And I believe, Miss Hargrove, that certain papers in that cabinet would benefit from being reviewed by someone with the appropriate understanding before they disappear." She held his gaze. "Before they disappear. Mr. Whitmore's new man of business," Thomas said carefully, "has been in that office twice this week. Alone." Elizabeth was very still. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't know," she said. "Mr. Whitmore," Thomas said with the delicacy of a man threading a needle in a high wind, "has been occupied with other matters this week. Other matters. The divorce. The witnesses. The sealed document. The performance of ending a marriage in front of 20 people, which had required planning and attention, and the particular emotional investment of a man who had convinced himself he was doing the right thing, while someone was in the estate office. Alone. Twice." "Thomas," she said, "bring me the key." She was in the estate office for 2 hours. She told Caroline she was resting. She told the housemaid who knocked at 4 o'clock that she did not need tea. She sat in the chair behind the desk that had always been Alexander's chair, at the desk that had always been Alexander's desk in the office, where she had spent 6 years providing guidance through the careful intermediary of suggestion and indirect counsel. And she read the papers in the locked lower cabinet with the full and undivided attention of a woman who no longer had any reason to pretend she didn't understand what she was reading. She understood it very well. She had understood it in pieces for 8 months. That was when she had first noticed the irregularities in the quarterly accounts. The small misalignments between income recorded and income received. The contracts with terms that didn't match the contracts she had helped negotiate. She had understood it in pieces and had been trying to address it in the oblique way available to her through letters to the solicitor, through careful questions at dinner that Alexander had begun interpreting as interference. Now, with the full documents in front of her, she understood it whole. Someone had been systematically defrauding the Whitmore estate for 8 months. Not dramatically. Not in large, obvious amounts that would be immediately visible. In the way that skilled fraud was always done slowly in amounts small enough to be explained individually, large enough to accumulate into something devastating over time. The estate was not yet ruined, but without intervention it would be. Not in 5 years. Not in 3. In 18 months, possibly less, the Whitmore family fortune would be hollowed out from the inside in a way that would be very difficult to explain to the men who held the family's social standing, and the man who would bear the weight of that failure was currently standing downstairs congratulating himself on having ended his marriage. She sat back in the chair. She thought about what she held in her hands. She could take this information to Alexander tonight. Walk into whatever room he was in, lay the papers on whatever table was convenient, and say your new man of business is robbing you, and here is the proof. She could do that. It was the obvious thing to do. It was what anyone who cared about Alexander, and she did. She had meant every word she said in the grand hall. She genuinely wished him well, would do immediately. She thought about the 20 people in the grand hall. She thought about the document she had signed with her maiden name. She thought about the way Alexander had reached for his brandy. She thought about Thomas saying Mr. Whitmore has been occupied with other matters this week, and the careful way he had said it, and what he had actually meant. She thought about 8 months of trying to tell Alexander something was wrong in the indirect way available to her, and 8 months of Alexander interpreting that as distance, as interference, as exactly the quality of wrong wife that had led to this afternoon. She had tried to tell him. He had not wanted to hear it. And now she was no longer his wife. She was Elizabeth Hargrove again. She looked at the papers. She made a decision. She took out a fresh sheet from the desk drawer. She did not think about whose desk it was, because it didn't matter anymore, and she began to write. Not to Alexander. To the family solicitor. She wrote for 40 minutes clearly and completely, laying out what she had found with the precision of a woman who had spent 6 years understanding the Whitmore estate's finances better than anyone in the family suspected. She documented the irregularities, the specific contracts, the amounts, the timeline, the pattern. She wrote the name of Alexander's new man of business and the specific actions she had evidence for. When she was done, she sealed the letter. She did not address it to Alexander. She addressed it to Mr. Harrington, the solicitor, with the instruction that it was to be opened and acted upon at his earliest professional convenience, and that the contents were confidential. She put it in her traveling case. She went upstairs and helped Caroline finish the packing. She did not tell Alexander what she had found. She had spent 6 years giving him her best counsel in ways that protected his pride and served his interests, and went unacknowledged because he didn't know they were hers. She was not going to walk out of his house on the day he divorced her and hand him a salvation he would spend the rest of his life being unable to acknowledge properly. She would protect the estate through the solicitor, anonymously, the way she had protected everything, because the secret she was carrying out of Alexander Whitmore's house was not just the evidence of fraud. It was the full accounting of everything she had done for 6 years, quietly and visibly, without credit, without acknowledgement, to keep the Whitmore name exactly as respected as Alexander believed it was entirely through his own efforts. And she was keeping that secret, not out of spite, not out of strategy, out of the particular dignity of a woman who understood finally and completely that some things you do not do for recognition. You do them because they are right. And then you walk away with your spine straight and your chin level and your hands still at your sides. And you let the truth find its own time. Tech. She left the Whitmore estate on the morning of the 15th of July, 1817, in a carriage that was not the Whitmore carriage pulled by horses that were not the Whitmore horses, with Caroline beside her, and 4 trunks on the back, and a green ledger in her lap, and a sealed letter in her traveling case addressed to a solicitor who would open it in the next week and begin a process that would in 3 months save a fortune belonging to a man who didn't yet know it needed saving. Alexander Whitmore stood at the top of the front steps. She did not know why he had come out. She had not expected him there. She had planned to leave without ceremony, without a final conversation, without the particular pain of a goodbye that would require her to hold herself together in front of the man she was saying goodbye to. He was there anyway. She looked at him through the carriage window. He was not performing anything. He was not arranged into a pose of dignity or authority or regret. He was simply standing there in his ordinary morning coat, without the good one, looking at the carriage with an expression she had not seen on his face and she could not remember the last time. An expression that was unguarded in the way that faces were unguarded in the very early morning or the very late night when the performance of the day hadn't yet assembled itself. He looked, she thought, like a man who had done something he could not undo and was only now understanding that. She held his gaze for 1 moment through the carriage window. She did not wave. She did not smile. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the grand hall, clearly, directly, without performance. And then the carriage moved, and she looked forward, because the woman who was leaving this estate was not the same woman who had arrived here 6 years ago, young and certain, and full of the particular belief that if you loved someone well enough and quietly enough and competently enough, they would eventually see you. She knew better now. And the knowing, painful as it was, real as it was, as heavy as it sat in her chest alongside everything else she was carrying this morning. The knowing was also, she thought, the beginning of something. She did not know yet what, but she was Elizabeth Hargrove again. Elizabeth Hargrove had always known how to begin, and beginning she discovered in the first week at her grandfather's estate was both easier and harder than she had anticipated. Easier because the work was familiar. Harder because the silence where a life used to be was louder than she had expected. Hargrove House had been empty for 3 years since her grandfather's death. The solicitor who managed the estate, a different solicitor from the Whitmore families, a man named Mr. Caldwell, who had known Elizabeth since she was 12 years old, and who received her arrival with the careful, unremarkable courtesy of someone who understood that the appropriate response to a woman rebuilding her life was to help her do it and ask no unnecessary questions, had kept the property in reasonable condition. The accounts were orderly. The small tenant farms on the surrounding land were producing. There was a household staff of 4, reduced from the 12 who had served her grandfather, but sufficient. It was not the Whitmore estate. It was hers. That distinction she found mattered in ways she had not anticipated. Every room she walked into was a room that belonged to her. Every decision she made was a decision that required no negotiation, no calibration against someone else's preferences, no careful management of the manner in which she presented an idea so that it would be received as suggestion rather than instruction. She made decisions, and they happened. It was extraordinary. It was also in the quiet hours of the first week profoundly lonely. She did not tell Caroline this. Caroline was 22 and fiercely loyal, and had followed her from the Whitmore estate without being asked, had simply appeared at the carriage with her own small trunk and said, "I assumed I was coming, ma'am," with the particular certainty of a young woman who has decided something and is not entertaining alternatives. Elizabeth was grateful for her in the way you were grateful for things you hadn't known you needed until they were there. But Caroline went to bed at 9 o'clock, and the house went quiet, and Elizabeth sat at her grandfather's writing desk. Her writing desk, now with the green ledgers open, and the silence pressing in from all sides, and she did what she had always done when things were difficult. She worked. The first letter from Mr. Harrington arrived on the 22nd of July. She had been at Hargrove House for 8 days. She was in the middle of reviewing the tenant farm accounts. There was an irregularity in the Southfield lease payments that she had noticed on her 3rd day, and had been tracing through 3 years of records, the kind of methodical forensic accounting that she had taught herself during the first year of her marriage, when she had discovered that the Whitmore estate accounts were less organized than everyone assumed when Caroline brought the letter. It was sealed with the Harrington firm's mark. She had corresponded with Mr. Harrington twice before, once regarding her grandfather's estate, probate once to establish the terms under which she would be managing Hargrove House. He was a precise man. His letters were brief. This one was not brief. She read it standing up, which was not how she usually read important documents, but was how her body apparently decided to receive this one. Mr. Harrington had opened her letter. He had reviewed the contents. He wrote immediately engaged a trusted colleague to conduct a discreet preliminary investigation of the matter she described. He had done this within 2 days of receiving her letter, which told her the contents had alarmed him sufficiently to override his natural professional deliberateness. He had found confirmation of every irregularity she had documented. He wrote, "The pattern you identified is, I regret to say, more extensive than even your thorough accounting suggested. The individual responsible has been operating in this manner for approximately 10 months, 2 months longer than your earliest identified instance. The total amount in question based on current investigation is in excess of $4,000. $4,000. She sat down. She had estimated 2,000, possibly 2,500 in her letter. She had been wrong in the direction she hadn't anticipated. Not an overestimate, but an underestimate. The fraud was larger than she had found in 2 hours in the estate office, which meant the man responsible had been more careful with the most recent months, had shown her the smaller, more recent instances, while the earlier, larger ones were buried deeper in records she hadn't had time to reach. She read the rest of the letter. Mr. Harrington had engaged the matter through a third party, as she had requested, in a way that would not immediately identify the source of the information. He had presented his findings to the Whitmore estate solicitor, not Alexander directly, but the solicitor first, which was the correct professional sequence, which would give the information time to be verified independently before Alexander was confronted with it. He expected the matter to be formally addressed within 3 weeks. He wrote at the bottom of the letter in a slightly less formal hand than the rest. Miss Hargrove, I have been a solicitor for 31 years. The quality of observation and documentation in your letter is not something I encounter often. I hope you will find at Hargrove House the circumstances to put those abilities to their proper use. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer with the brass key. She sat for a long time. $4,000. 10 months. And Alexander, who had been occupied with other matters, occupied with the performance of ending his marriage with the 20 witnesses, with the sealed document, had not seen it happening. She had seen it. She had always seen it. And she was not his wife anymore. So, Caldwell came on a Thursday. Mr. Caldwell, the Hargrove estate solicitor, was 71 years old and had the deliberate manner of a man who had learned long ago that most situations could be navigated successfully if you simply refused to be hurried by them. He arrived with a folder of accounts and a pot of tea that he had apparently instructed the kitchen to prepare before he arrived, which told her he expected to stay a while. They sat in the study and went through the Hargrove accounts together. This was, Elizabeth discovered, a qualitatively different experience from every financial conversation she had participated in during her marriage. Caldwell spoke to her directly. He explained things without simplifying them first. When she asked a question, he answered the question she had asked rather than a more comfortable adjacent question. When she identified an issue, he said, "Yes, you're right," and wrote it down without the particular pause that men inserted before agreeing with her in the Whitmore world. The pause that said, "Let me determine whether it's appropriate to agree with this." After 2 hours, she said, "Mr. Caldwell, the Southfield lease." "Yes," he said. "The payment history shows 3 irregular amounts in the past 18 months, she said. "The lessee, Mr. Dunmore, has been paying approximately 8% less than the contracted rate, not every quarter, specifically in the quarters following the harvest, which suggests he's calculating based on yield rather than the contracted fixed amount." Caldwell looked at her over his reading glasses. "I had not identified that," he said. He said it without embarrassment, which she appreciated. "It's a small enough variance that it doesn't stand out in a quarterly review," she said. "It's only visible when you look at the pattern across 6 quarters." She paused. "I'd like to write to Mr. Dunmore." "Shall I write on your behalf?" Caldwell said. "No," she said. "I'll write myself, in my own name." She paused. "It's my estate." Caldwell looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." He made a note. "There are a few other matters I should bring to your attention. Your grandfather was a capable manager, but in his final years, certain arrangements were made that I would categorize as informal, and that deserve your review." He opened a different section of the folder. "Specifically, there is a standing agreement with the Miller family regarding water rights on the North Field that has never been formally documented." She looked up. "An undocumented water rights agreement." "A handshake arrangement," Caldwell said. "Your grandfather trusted the Miller family, and the Miller family is by all accounts trustworthy. But a handshake arrangement is not a legal instrument. How long has it been operating on a handshake?" 14 years, Caldwell said. She thought about 14 years of an undocumented arrangement that could be disputed at any moment that gave the Hargrove estate zero legal standing in any disagreement that depended entirely on the continued goodwill of people who might not always be the same people. "I'll need to meet with the Millers," she said. "This week if possible." Caldwell was making notes rapidly. He paused and looked up at her. "Miss Hargrove," he said, and his voice had shifted slightly warmer, more direct. "I managed your grandfather's estate for 23 years. He was a good man, and a capable man, and he trusted me appropriately." He paused. "I don't believe I will need to explain things to you the way I sometimes needed to explain them to him." She looked at him. "I take that as a compliment." "It is one," he said. "A significant one." She went back to the accounts. The news from the Whitmore estate arrived on the 1st of August, and it arrived not through official channels, but through Margaret Preston, who was one of the 20 witnesses at the Grand Hall, and who had been, for most of Elizabeth's marriage, the closest thing she had to a genuine friend in that social world. Margaret arrived at Hargrove House unannounced, which was not Margaret's way. Margaret was a woman who called ahead and arrived precisely when she said she would arrive, and brought appropriate gifts, and followed every social convention with the careful attention of someone who genuinely believed conventions served a purpose. Her arriving unannounced, without a gift, slightly breathless at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, said everything. "Sit down," Elizabeth said when she saw her face. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "Sit down first." Margaret sat. She accepted tea from Caroline with the automatic courtesy of a woman who received things gracefully even in distress. She held the cup without drinking from it. "There has been a development," Margaret said, "at the Whitmore estate." Elizabeth waited. "Mr. Harrington came to see Alexander last week," Margaret said, "with another solicitor. And I believe a representative of the county. They had documents." She looked at Elizabeth. "There was a fraud in the estate accounts. Alexander's new man of business, the one he hired in March, has apparently been for nearly a year." "I know," Elizabeth said. Margaret stopped. She looked at Elizabeth. The room was very quiet. "You know," Margaret said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a woman recategorizing something. "I found it before I left," Elizabeth said. She kept her voice even. "I addressed it through the appropriate channels." Margaret looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Elizabeth could see her working through it, the timeline, the grand hall, the signed document, the carriage on the morning of the 15th, recalculating everything she thought she understood about the sequence of events. "You found evidence of fraud against Alexander's estate," Margaret said slowly, "on the day he divorced you." "Yes." "And you—" Margaret stopped, started again. "You didn't tell him." "I told Mr. Harrington," Elizabeth said, "through proper channels, anonymously." "Anonymously," Margaret repeated. She set down her teacup. She looked at Elizabeth with an expression that Elizabeth had never seen on her face before, not in 6 years of friendship, not across dinner tables and drawing rooms, and all the spaces where women of their world said the things they actually meant in the small gaps between the things they were supposed to say. "Elizabeth, the man divorced you that morning. And that afternoon you—" "I did what was right," Elizabeth said. "For the estate. For the family name. For—" She paused. "For reasons that have nothing to do with Alexander." "What reasons?" Margaret said. Elizabeth looked at her directly. "Because the Whitmore tenants depend on the estate's stability," she said. "Because there are families in those fields whose livelihoods are attached to whether the Whitmore accounts are sound. Because the fraud, if it had continued unchecked, would have caused damage that extended well beyond one man's pride or one family's name." She paused. "Those people didn't divorce me. I had no reason to let them suffer for something I knew how to prevent." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then, "Does he know it was you?" "No," Elizabeth said. "Will you tell him?" Elizabeth looked at her teacup. She thought about this, had thought about it in the nights at Hargrove House when the work was done and the silence was loud. She had thought about it with the clarity that comes when you have no one to perform for, when the calculation is purely private. "No," she said. "Why?" Margaret said. "Because if I tell him," Elizabeth said, "it becomes something he owes me. And I don't want him to owe me." She looked up. "I want him to simply not have lost his estate. Anonymously. That's all." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something Elizabeth had not heard her say before in 6 years. "I was wrong about this marriage." Elizabeth looked at her. I thought Alexander had chosen well," Margaret said. "I thought he was fortunate. I thought you were a suitable match." She paused. "I did not think I didn't understand what you were doing." She shook her head. "Nobody did." "No," Elizabeth said. "Nobody did. He doesn't deserve—" "Margaret," Elizabeth said it gently. "This isn't about what he deserves. It stopped being about that when I signed the paper. She looked at her hands. It's about what I do, regardless. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, the $4,000, that's what they're saying. I estimated 2, Elizabeth said. I missed the earlier months. How did you find it at all? Margaret said. In 2 hours in an office you weren't supposed to be in on the day your marriage ended. I'd been finding it for 8 months, Elizabeth said. I just hadn't been able to prove it until I saw the primary documents. Margaret stared at her. 8 months? You knew for 8 months. I suspected. I couldn't act on suspicion. Why didn't you tell Alexander? Elizabeth looked at her. The answer to this question was the answer to everything, to the grand hall, to the signed paper, to 6 years of careful, invisible, unacknowledged work. She had tried to tell him. She had tried in the ways available to her, the indirect, careful ways that were the only ways open to a woman in her position, and each attempt had been received as interference, or distance, or the wrong kind of wife. I tried, she said. He didn't. She stopped, chose her words carefully. He wasn't looking at me as someone who could see those things. So when I tried to show him, he didn't see what I was showing him. He saw you criticizing, Margaret said. He saw me overstepping, Elizabeth said. There's a difference. Margaret sat with that, then very quietly. What are you going to do now? Elizabeth looked at the account books open on the desk behind her. She looked at the letter from Caldwell with the water rights issue flagged in the margin. She thought about Mr. Dunmore and the Southfield lease and the undocumented Miller family arrangement and the 3 years of accounts that she was systematically reviewing and the estate that was hers, entirely hers, and the decisions she made that simply happened without negotiation. Run my estate, she said. Build something of my own. August moved into September, and September brought a rhythm that Elizabeth had not experienced in her adult life. Her days were her own. That was the simplest way to describe it, and it was not simple at all. Her days were her own. Her decisions were her own. Her mornings were structured by what she chose to do rather than what was expected of her in the role of Whitmore wife. She rose early. She had always risen early, had always done her best thinking in the quiet hours before the household demanded things of her. But in the Whitmore house, the early morning had belonged to the preparation of a day that served someone else's purposes. Here, the early morning belonged to her. She developed a practice. Every morning, the accounts first, then correspondence, then any meetings with Caldwell or the tenants or the suppliers. In the afternoons, the physical work of the estate, the parts that required her presence rather than her pen. She walked the fields. She met the tenants. She learned the names of the people who worked Hargrove land in the specific direct way that her grandfather had known them. First names, family situations, the particular problems of each lease and each harvest, rather than the formal distance that the Whitmore estate had always maintained between the house and the people who served it. Mr. Dunmore, the Southfield lessee, was a broad-weathered man of about 50 who had the careful wariness of someone who expected the new owner of a property to be difficult. He met her at the field boundary on a Wednesday morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone preparing for an argument. She showed him the payment records. She showed him the contracted amount. She showed him the variance. She did this without anger, without accusation, without the performance of authority that would have made him defensive and reduced the conversation to a contest of positions. She simply showed him the numbers. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. I thought, he said slowly, that the arrangement had changed. When Mr. Hargrove passed, I thought... He stopped. Nobody corrected me. Nobody was reviewing the accounts closely enough to identify it. She said, I am. He was quiet for a moment. The difference, he said. I'll make it right. I know you will, she said. I'm not interested in the back amount. The arrangement was informal enough that I consider the liability shared. Going forward, the contracted amount. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected an adversary and had encountered something else. Yes, ma'am, he said. And Mr. Dunmore, she said. "If the harvest is poor and the contracted amount becomes genuinely difficult, come to me directly. I would rather know than discover it in the accounts 6 months later." He looked at her for a moment. "Mr. Hargrove said the same thing," he said. "Your grandfather. First time I met him." "Good," she said. "Then it runs in the family." She walked back to the house with the particular satisfaction of a problem that had been addressed cleanly without drama, without the escalation that could have made it something larger than it needed to be. She thought, "This is what I have always been good at." She had been good at it for 6 years in someone else's house. It was different, staggeringly quietly, fundamentally different, to be good at it in her own. The twist arrived on the 14th of September, exactly 2 months after the Grand Hall. It arrived in the form of a letter she did not expect from a person she had not heard from since the morning of July 15th, written in a hand she knew as well as she knew her own. Thomas. The letter was brief. Thomas was not a man of many words, and whatever he was not someone who confused brevity with insufficiency. "Miss Hargrove," he wrote, "I write in my own capacity, not on behalf of the household. I believe you are owed information that you will not receive through other channels. Mr. Whitmore knows, not the full extent, not the source. But Mr. Harrington's investigation in confirming the fraud raised questions about the timeline that Mr. Whitmore has begun to consider. He knows that someone identified the irregularities before the investigation began. He knows the identification was precise and detailed. He knows it could not have come from anyone without intimate knowledge of the accounts. He has not spoken this aloud to anyone. He has been for the past 2 weeks very quiet. I thought you should know what the quietness means. Respectfully, T. Elizabeth read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it and sat for a long time without reading anything else. Alexander was quiet. She knew what Alexander's quietness meant. She had lived with it for 6 years, the specific quality of his silence when he was working through something that didn't resolve easily, when the comfortable certainties he maintained were running into information that didn't fit them. He went quiet, the way certain rivers went quiet before a bend, all the energy moving underneath, none of it visible on the surface. He was working through something. She thought about what Thomas had written. He knows the identification was precise and detailed. He knows it could not have come from anyone without intimate knowledge of the accounts. He was working toward her, not quickly, not directly, in the circling, reluctant way of a man who is approaching a conclusion he doesn't want to reach because reaching it requires him to revise things he has held as certain. She thought about what it would mean when he arrived at the conclusion. She thought about what she would say. She thought about the gray dress and the signed paper and the carriage on the morning of July 15th, and the way he had looked at her through the window unguarded, unperforming the face of a man who had done something he couldn't undo and was only just beginning to understand it. She put Thomas's letter in the drawer with the brass key. She picked up her pen. She had accounts to review. She had an estate to run. She had a life that was entirely her own for the first time, and she was not going to set it down and wait for a man to finish thinking. If Alexander Whitmore wanted to find her, he knew where she was. She had always been exactly where she was. He had simply never taken the time to look, and Alexander Whitmore, sitting alone in the estate office on a Tuesday morning in late September, was beginning to understand the full cost of that failure, with a clarity that was in its way more painful than anything he had expected to feel when this was all over. He had expected relief. He had planned for relief. He had spent the months before July 14th telling himself that the end of the marriage would feel like the setting down of something heavy, a weight he had been carrying. A tension he had been managing, the particular strain of living alongside someone who made him feel, without ever saying a word about it, that he was not quite seeing something important. He had convinced himself that the source of that discomfort was Elizabeth, that removing her from the equation would remove the discomfort. He had been wrong. The discomfort had not left when Elizabeth left. It had gotten louder. He understood now, sitting at the desk with the Harrington investigation documents spread in front of him for the 4th time this week, that the discomfort had never been about Elizabeth at all. It had been about what Elizabeth could see that he couldn't, and what he had done when that difference had made him feel insufficient. He had divorced her for knowing more than he did. Not in those words, not in those conscious, articulable terms. But that was what it came down to when he stripped away everything else and looked at the actual mechanics of his decision. She had known things. She had tried in the careful, oblique ways available to her to share what she knew. He had received her knowledge as a form of criticism, and her silence on certain matters as a form of distance, and both interpretations had been wrong, and he had built a decision on top of wrong interpretations, and enacted that decision in front of 20 witnesses. And then she had walked out of his house with a green ledger and a traveling case. And 8 days later, someone had sent Mr. Harrington a letter that saved his estate. He knew it was her. He knew it the way you knew things that you had arrived at through evidence, rather than instinct, with a certainty that was uncomfortable precisely because it was unassailable. He had reviewed the timeline. He had thought about who had access, who had knowledge, who could have identified the pattern in the time available. He had eliminated every other possibility. It was Elizabeth. Elizabeth, who had signed the divorce paper with her maiden name and said, "I hope you find what you are looking for," and walked out of the grand hall on the day he had publicly set her aside, had spent 2 hours in his estate office that afternoon, identifying a fraud that he hadn't seen in 10 months, had written a letter to a solicitor and had saved his family's fortune, anonymously, without telling him, without any apparent intention of ever telling him. He sat with the documents and the silence of the estate office and the very loud, very clear sound of a man understanding something too late. Thomas found him there at noon. Thomas had a quality that Alexander had always taken for granted, the ability to appear in a room at precisely the moment he was needed and to know without being told what kind of appearing was required. Sometimes that meant arriving with something practical. Coffee, a document, an appointment reminder. Sometimes it meant arriving and simply being present, which was its own form of usefulness. Today he arrived with coffee and nothing else. He set it on the desk. He looked at the documents spread across the surface. He did not comment on them. "Thomas," Alexander said. "Sir? How long did you know about the accounts?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for a specific question and is now deciding exactly how to answer it. "I suspected something was irregular in the spring," Thomas said. "I didn't have the ability to verify what I suspected." "Who else suspected?" Another pause. "I cannot speak for others with certainty." Alexander looked at him. He had known Thomas for 35 years. Thomas had been in this house when Alexander was born, had been the constant background presence of his entire life. He knew Thomas's pauses, the way he knew weather patterns. This particular pause meant Thomas was being precise rather than evasive. He was not saying he couldn't speak for others. He was saying he wouldn't attribute knowledge to someone else without certainty. "Elizabeth," Alexander said. Not a question. Thomas looked at the desk. "I believe Miss Hargrove misses." He stopped. "I believe she was aware of certain irregularities before July." "How long before July?" "I cannot say with certainty." "Thomas?" Thomas looked at him. Direct for the first time in this conversation. "I believe she had been watching the accounts carefully for some months," he said. "And I believe she found it very difficult to address what she saw through the channels available to her." The channels available to her. Alexander heard that phrase and felt it land with a weight that Thomas had certainly intended it to carry. The channels available to her. Not the channels available to the manager of an estate. Not the channels available to someone with direct authority over the finances. The channels available to a wife. The oblique channels. The suggestion, not instruction channels. The "here is an idea I thought you might" consider channels that required the person on the receiving end to be paying attention and to be disposed to receive what was being offered. He had not been paying attention. He had not been disposed. "She tried to tell me," he said. It was not a question. Thomas was quiet. "She tried to tell me and I—" He stopped. He thought about the dinners where Elizabeth had made careful observations about the accounts, and he had responded with the particular impatience of a man who has decided his wife is overstepping. He thought about the morning she had asked about the quarterly statements from Aldridge and Sons, And he had told her with a politeness that was not actually polite that the financial matters were being handled. He thought about the letter she had started and never finished the one he had seen on her desk, once addressed to the solicitor, that she had covered with another paper when he entered the room. He had thought she was writing personal correspondence. She had been trying to document a fraud. "How much did she find?" he said. "In the time she had?" Thomas considered. "I believe she found the pattern correctly," he said. "Perhaps not the full extent, but the shape of it." "In 2 hours," Alexander said. "In the estate office, on the afternoon of July 14th. Thomas said nothing. Alexander stopped. "While I was accepting congratulations from the guests." The silence in the room was complete. Thomas set down the coffee tray more carefully than was necessary, the small, deliberate gesture of a man giving another man a moment to absorb something difficult. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" he said. Alexander looked at the documents. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the window. "No," he said. "Thank you, Thomas." Thomas left. Alexander sat alone with the full weight of what he now understood, and understood that understanding it was only the beginning. The harder thing, the thing that was going to require more of him than he was certain he had, was deciding what to do with it. Margaret Preston came to see him on a Thursday. He had not asked her to come. Margaret arrived because Margaret had decided he needed to be seen in person, which was Margaret's way of managing situations. She considered serious. She appeared in person and made certain the conversation happened whether or not the other party had planned for it. She sat in the drawing room with the posture of a woman who has something to say and is going to say it regardless of how it is received. "You look terrible," she said by way of opening. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. "When did you last sleep properly?" "I'm not sure that's Alexander." She said it the way Elizabeth had sometimes said his name clearly, without inflection, cutting through the surface of things to whatever was actually happening underneath. He noticed the similarity and did not know what to do with it. "I went to see Elizabeth." He was very still. "She's well," Margaret said. "More than well, actually. She's running Hargrove House with a capability that is... I'll be honest with you, it's remarkable to watch. Caldwell told me privately that in 2 months she's identified and addressed more issues in the estate management than had been noticed in the previous 3 years. She paused. She found an undocumented water rights arrangement that has existed for 14 years and is currently converting it into a proper legal instrument. She corrected a payment irregularity with one of the tenant leaseholders in a single conversation that apparently left the man feeling he'd been treated fairly rather than punished. Another pause. She's doing in her own house openly and directly what she spent 6 years doing in yours, without anyone knowing it was her. Alexander absorbed this without speaking. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Margaret said. "Yes," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "Not fully." She leaned forward slightly. "I sat in that drawing room in July and watched you end your marriage in front of 20 people because Elizabeth was too capable. Because she knew things, and managed things, and understood things at a level that made you feel what exactly? Diminished, unnecessary. Margaret, I'm not asking to be unkind," she said. "I'm asking because I was in that room, Alexander, and I watched her sign that paper and walk out with her spine straight and her chin level and no expression on her face that anyone could use against her. And I thought she was managing herself. I didn't understand until I went to see her that she was managing something much larger than herself." She sat back. "She knew about the fraud." Alexander said nothing. "She knew for months," Margaret said. "She tried to find a way to tell you couldn't reach you through the channels you left available to her. And then on the day you divorced her, spent 2 hours in your estate office documenting it precisely enough to give to a solicitor." She looked at him. "And then she left, and said nothing, and saved your estate from the outside anonymously, because she believed the right thing was the right thing, regardless of what you had done to her that morning." The room was very quiet. "She didn't do it for you," Margaret said. "I want to be clear about that. I asked her and she was clear. She did it because the tenants depended on the estate's stability, because there were families attached to the Whitmore name who had nothing to do with your marriage. She paused. She did it because that is the kind of woman she is. And you spent 6 years not seeing it. Alexander stood up. He went to the window. He stood there with his back to Margaret because he needed a moment in which his face was not visible, and Margaret, to her credit, let him have it. "What do I do?" he said finally. "That," Margaret said, "is the first useful question you've asked." He turned around. "You go to her," Margaret said. "Not to ask her to come back, not to make a case for yourself, not with a plan or a proposal or anything prepared." She held his gaze. "You go to her and you tell the truth. What you know. What you understand now that you didn't understand before. What it cost." She paused. "And then you listen. Completely. Without deciding in advance what you're willing to hear." Alexander looked at her. "And if she—" "That's not your question to answer," Margaret said. "That's hers." The letter arrived at Hargrove House on the 1st of October. Elizabeth was in the middle of a meeting with the Miller family father-son and the son's wife, who turned out to be the sharpest legal mind in the room, which Elizabeth noted with the appreciation of someone who recognized the quality precisely when Caroline came to the door of the study, with the particular expression that meant something had arrived that she didn't know how to categorize. "Later," Elizabeth said, without looking up from the water rights document she was reviewing with the younger Miller. "Yes, ma'am," Caroline said. She hesitated. "It's from the Whitmore estate." Elizabeth looked up. She looked at Caroline's face. "Later," she said again. More quietly this time. Caroline left. The Miller meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Elizabeth gave it her complete attention, which required more active effort than it usually did, because a portion of her mind had immediately gone to the letter and what it might contain and what she was going to do about it, and she had to deliberately, continuously redirect that portion back to water rights documentation, which she did, because the Miller family had come to her in good faith and deserved her full attention. When they left, she sat at the desk for exactly 2 minutes. Then she opened the letter. It was from Thomas. "Miss Hargrove. He knows. He has known for 2 weeks. He is not well. I am telling you this not to influence your decisions, but because I believe you are owed accurate information. Respectfully, T." She set it down. She picked it up. She set it down again. "He is not well." That was Thomas being precise in the way Thomas was always precise, choosing words that meant exactly what they said, and not one thing more. Thomas did not exaggerate. Thomas did not deploy emotion for effect. If Thomas said Alexander was not well, Alexander was not well in a way that Thomas considered worth reporting. She sat with this for a long time. The part of her that had been living at Hargrove House for 2 months, the part that rose early and managed accounts and walked fields and met tenants and made decisions that simply happened. That part looked at Thomas's letter with something that was not quite coldness, but was adjacent to it. That part said, "This is not your problem. You signed the paper. You addressed the fraud. You did what was right. What happens to him now is what happens to him." But there was another part. A part that had loved a man for 6 years. A part that had watched him through a carriage window and seen his face unguarded. A part that still prayed in the quiet of the early morning that he would find whatever he was looking for and meant it. That part read, "He is not well," and felt it. She locked the letter in the drawer. She went to find Caroline. The third letter came not from Thomas, but from Mr. Harrington. It arrived on the 8th of October, and it was longer than his previous correspondence, 2 full pages, which for Harrington represented an unusual departure from his natural precision. He wrote, concluded the investigation into the Whitmore estate fraud. The man responsible had been identified, confronted, and the matter referred to the appropriate authorities. The amount recovered through a combination of direct restitution and legal action was substantial. The estate's financial position, he was pleased to report, was sound. Then he wrote something that made her read the paragraph 3 times. In the course of the investigation, it became necessary to reveal to Mr. Whitmore that the initial identification of the fraud was made by a party with intimate knowledge of the accounts some weeks before my involvement. Mr. Whitmore pressed this matter with considerable determination, and after consultation with my professional obligations and the interests of all parties, I disclosed to him that the identification came from a letter written by yourself. She stopped breathing for a moment. Harrington had told him, "I want you to understand." Harrington continued that this disclosure was not made lightly. However, I concluded that Mr. Whitmore's right to know the full truth of what had occurred on his estate and who had acted in his interest outweighed the consideration of anonymity at this stage. The fraud had been resolved. The protection that anonymity was designed to provide, namely, that your action not be used as leverage or obligation, was no longer the operative concern. What remained was the truth. Mr. Whitmore's response to this information I will leave for him to convey to you directly, as it is not my place to represent his words or his state. I will say only that it was not the response of a man who was comfortable with what he learned. She put the letter down. She picked it up. She read it again. Harrington knew her. He had known her since she was 12 years old. He had written those careful, precise paragraphs with the deliberate intention of telling her exactly what she needed to know in exactly the right amount of words. It was not the response of a man who was comfortable with what he learned. That was Harrington's version of Alexander knows the full truth, and it has broken something in him. She sat very still. She thought about the grand hall, about the document, about the way he had reached for his brandy instead of her hand. About 6 years of trying to reach him through the only channels available to her and arriving always just short of contact. She thought about what it would mean that he knew. Not just knew about the fraud, knew about the months of watching, knew about the letter to Harrington written on the afternoon of the divorce, knew that on the day he had publicly ended their marriage in front of 20 witnesses, his wife had spent 2 hours in his estate office doing what she had spent 6 years doing, quietly, precisely, invisibly protecting something he didn't know needed protecting. He knew all of it, and Harrington said he was not comfortable. She stood up. She went to the window. She stood there for a long time with her hand flat against the cool glass, feeling the October air on the other side of it, and she made no decision. And she made every decision simultaneously, which was, she thought, exactly what honest feeling looked like when you stopped trying to manage it. She had been managing herself for 6 years. She had been managing herself for 3 months. She was very tired of managing. He came on a Wednesday. She knew he was coming before she saw him. Caroline came to the study at 10 in the morning with the expression she now used specifically for unexpected arrivals of significance, and said, "Ma'am," and stopped, and Elizabeth looked at her face and said, "I'll be in the study," and Caroline said, "Yes, ma'am," and went to show him in. He came in alone, no hat in his hands. This time he was holding his hat, but not in the supplicant's gesture of their previous unexpected meetings in this story. He was simply holding it the way a man holds something he doesn't know where to put, because he came without a plan for where to put things. He looked different from July 14th, not older exactly. Something else. He looked like a man who had been through a sustained interior experience and had come out the other side of it without the composure he had always worn as a matter of course. The composure was still there. He was still Alexander Whitmore. She was not going to pretend he had been transformed into a different person, but it was thinner. Underneath it, she could see something that she had not seen in 6 years. She could see him being uncertain. He stood in the doorway of her study, her desk, her accounts open on the surface, her life organized precisely the way she organized it, without negotiation, without adjustment for anyone else's expectations. And he looked at her. "Elizabeth," he said. "Alexander," she said. She did not stand up. She did not offer tea. She did not perform any of the social mechanics that would have given the visit a comfortable shape. She looked at him from behind her desk and waited. He came into the room. He sat in the chair across the desk from her, the chair that Caldwell used, the chair that Dunmore had sat in when she showed him the lease records, the chair that had become in her mind the chair for people who had come to work something out. He sat with his hat in his lap. He looked at the desk. Then he looked at her. "Harrington told me," he said. "I know," she said. "He told me he had." Alexander looked at her for a moment. He seemed to be checking something, verifying that she already knew, that he didn't have to manage her reaction to the disclosure itself, that they could move past the announcement and into the substance. "I want to tell you what I know," he said. "All of it. And I want to tell you what I understand now that I didn't understand before. And then I want to hear whatever you want to say. Or nothing, if that's what you choose." He paused. "I'm not here to make a case for myself." She looked at him. "Then say what you came to say." He said it. He was not eloquent. He had never been eloquent about emotional matters that had always been part of the difficulty. The fact that he expressed himself precisely in business and in social situations and became awkward and insufficient in the specific territory of genuine feeling. He was awkward now. He said things that were not perfectly organized, and that repeated themselves slightly, and that required him to stop twice and look at his hat and start again. But he was honest. He told her that he had known before July that she had been trying to tell him something about the accounts. He had known and had interpreted it as criticism and had shut it down. He told her that he had convinced himself the problem in the marriage was her knowledge that she knew too much about things. He needed to feel he managed, and that her knowing made him feel insufficient. And that feeling insufficient had made him angry, and that the anger had looked in his own experience of it like a legitimate grievance against her, rather than a response to his own discomfort. He told her about the 2 weeks after the investigation, the 2 weeks of very quiet that Thomas had reported. He told her what those 2 weeks had actually contained, the systematic reconstruction of 6 years of their marriage, from the vantage point of what he now understood, going back through every dinner conversation, and every question she had raised, and every letter she had started, and every oblique suggestion she had made, and understanding for the first time, and in the correct sequence, what she had actually been saying. He told her that he had found in that reconstruction evidence of something he had never looked for while it was happening, that she had been protecting him. Not in the patronizing sense, not in the way that implied he was incapable, but in the way that a person who loves someone and understands something they don't yet see tries to create conditions for that person to be safe while they catch up. She had known things and had tried to find ways to share the knowing that preserved his dignity, and he had received the attempts as assaults on his dignity and had responded accordingly. He stopped. He looked at his hat. "I lost my wife," he said, "because I never took the time to see her." He said it slowly, the way you say something you have finally gotten exactly right after a long time of not quite getting it. "I didn't lose you because you were wrong for this family, or wrong for this marriage. I lost you because I never looked at who you actually were." He looked up. "I was looking at what I expected a wife to be. And you weren't that. You were considerably more than that." His voice was not steady, and I treated the considerably more as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. The room was very quiet. Elizabeth looked at him. She had planned in the part of herself that still planned things to be composed, to receive what he said with the same level voice and still hands that she had brought to the Grand Hall in July. She had decided she would not perform grief or anger or relief because she was done performing, because the great project of the past 3 months had been the systematic end of performing. She was not composed. She was not crying. She had still not cried. It was still in the locked place. Some habits were very old, but she was not composed. She was present in a way she had not been present with anyone since July, the protective management fully down the thing underneath it visible. She said, "I was never asking you to need me." He looked at her. "I was asking you to value me," she said. "There is a very large difference." She held his gaze. "Needing is about you. Valuing is about me. I didn't want to be necessary to you. I wanted to be seen by you." She paused. "Those are different things." He absorbed this. He said, "I know." He said it with the simplicity of a man who has finally arrived at a place after a very long journey, and the simplicity was not dismissal, but arrival. I know the difference now. I didn't then. He paused. I'm not certain knowing it now is enough. I don't know if it's enough to... I don't know what it's enough for. He looked at her. I came because you deserve to hear it directly from me. Not through Harrington, not through Margaret, from me. He paused. I also came because... He stopped. Because, she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in 6 years of marriage, the expression that had been on his face through the carriage window, the unguarded one, the one that existed before the performance of himself assembled. Because I needed to see you, he said. Simply that. Elizabeth sat with his words in the quiet study of her own house, her own life arranged around her, and she felt the locked place in her chest, the one that had held the tears since July 14th, feel the weight of the key. She did not open it, not yet, but she felt it, and she thought he came. He sat in this chair in my study, with his hat in his lap, and he said the true thing without dressing it up. He said I never took the time to see her, and he meant it, and he said I needed to see you, and he meant that too. It was not enough. She knew clearly and completely that it was not enough to undo 6 years and 1 grand hall and 20 witnesses and the signed paper with her maiden name. But it was something. It was the beginning of something. And Elizabeth Hargrove, who had spent her entire life knowing how to begin, understood what that meant better than anyone. She looked at him. Would you like tea? She said. He blinked. Then very slowly, with the cautious quality of a man who is not sure yet what he is being offered, but knows it is more than the surface of the question, yes, he said, I would. She called for Caroline. And the conversation began, the real one, the long one, the one that neither of them had been capable of inside the architecture of what their marriage had been. And it lasted 3 hours, which was longer than Alexander had planned, and exactly as long as it needed to be. Caroline brought tea, and then brought more tea, and then, understanding without being told that this was not a visit, with a polite conclusion, quietly arranged for a light meal to be left on the side table, and withdrew without interrupting. Elizabeth noticed this, and felt the particular gratitude she had been accumulating for Caroline since July, the gratitude of someone who has discovered in the stripping away of unnecessary things which presences in her life were genuinely essential. Caroline was essential. This conversation was something else. Not essential in the way food and shelter were essential. Essential in the way that certain reckonings were essential. The ones that, if avoided, didn't disappear, but calcified and caused damage in their calcified state that was harder to address than the original difficulty would have been. She had been a woman who avoided nothing. He was a man who had avoided a great deal and was now sitting in her chair across her desk in her house, doing the thing he had spent 6 years not doing. Looking at her, not at the idea of her, not at what a Whitmore wife should be or should know or should present to the world. At her, Elizabeth, the woman who had been in the room with him for 6 years. It was, she thought, too bad it had taken this long. It was also, she thought, happening now. And now was what she had. The 3 hours were not comfortable. She had not expected comfort, and she did not seek it. And when Alexander said things that landed painfully, she did not soften her face to protect him from knowing they had landed. She let him see it. She let her face do what her face had been doing privately for 3 months and had not been doing publicly for 6 years. She let him see the truth of how things had reached her, and she watched him receive it. He did not look away. That was the thing she had not expected. She had prepared herself for the Alexander. She knew the man who, when confronted with his own discomfort, redirected to safer territory, who changed the subject with such natural ease that you sometimes didn't notice the change had happened. She had prepared for that, Alexander, and received a different one. A man who looked at what she showed him and stayed with it, even when staying with it, was clearly costing him something. She told him about the quarterly accounts. Not the fraud he knew about the fraud, now had been living with the knowledge of it for weeks. She told him about the months before the fraud. The months of first noticing that the accounts she had access to the household accounts. The records she was permitted to review in her capacity as mistress of the house didn't quite match the picture of the estate's finances that she built from the larger pattern she could observe indirectly. She told him how she had tried to address it. The specific conversations, the specific moments. He listened to each one, and she watched him locate them in his own memory. Watched his face change as the recalibration happened in real time as he replaced his version of those conversations with the version she was giving him, and understood the gap between the two. "The dinner in April," he said, 1816. "You asked me about the Aldridge statements." "Yes," she said. "I told you the finances were being handled." "You told me not to concern myself," she said. More precisely, he was quiet for a moment. "I was embarrassed," he said. "I didn't know what was in the Aldridge statements at that point. I had delegated it entirely to—" He stopped. "I didn't want you to ask questions I couldn't answer." She looked at him. "So you told me not to ask?" "Yes, and I interpreted that as you didn't trust my judgment about the accounts." "I was protecting my own pride," he said. "I wasn't thinking about what it communicated to you." "No," she said, "you weren't." He absorbed that. He did not flinch from it. "The letter you were writing," he said. "The one I saw on your desk, the one you covered." "Yes." "Was that the Harrington letter?" "Not yet," she said. "That was an earlier attempt, a different approach." She looked at her hands. "I'd been trying to find a way to raise the issue that you would receive, not as interference, not as overstepping." She paused. "I hadn't found the right approach yet. You walked in, I covered the letter, and you—" She stopped. "I asked what you were writing," he said. "Yes." "And you said personal correspondence." "Yes." "And I—" He stopped. He was working through it. "I was relieved. I remember being relieved." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew I was relieved." "I could see it," she said. "You relaxed. The question was answered, and you relaxed and moved on." She paused. "That was the moment I understood that the approach I had been trying, the indirect approach, the careful approach, wasn't working. That I needed to do something more direct." She paused again. "And I also understood in that moment that I had been trying to protect your ease at the cost of addressing something real. That the two things were incompatible, and I had been choosing the wrong one." The room was very quiet. "Why?" he said. "Why did you keep choosing it, the protecting my ease? Why did that keep winning?" She looked at him. It was the question she had been asking herself since July. In the early mornings at Hargrove House, when the work was done and the silence was full and there was no one to perform for. Why had she kept choosing it? Why had she spent 6 years navigating around his pride with such careful skill that he had never even known she was doing it? She had arrived at an answer. She was not certain it was a complete answer, but it was an honest one. "Because I thought that was what loving someone meant," she said. "Making things smooth for them. Managing the difficult parts so they didn't have to encounter them sharply." She paused. "My mother did it for my father. Beautifully. With such skill that my father died believing he had managed everything himself." She looked at Alexander. "I thought I was loving you the way my mother had loved my father." "What changed?" he said. "July 14th, she said. "The moment you signed your name, and I understood that the smoothing, the managing, had made me invisible. That you had spent 6 years living alongside someone who was running things you thought you were running, and you had no idea. And instead of seeing that as love, you had experienced it as—" She stopped. "As absence," he said quietly. "As something missing." "Yes." He looked at his hands. "You were so present," he said. "Every day. And I experienced you as not there. Not fully there." He looked up. "How does that happen?" "When someone shows you a version of themselves designed to not disturb you," she said, "you start to believe the version. And the real person is right there, but you're not looking at the real person. You're looking at the version." She paused. "I built the version very carefully. I thought it was kindness. It wasn't." She held his gaze. "It was a way of not risking being rejected for who I actually was." The silence after that statement had a different quality from the silences that had come before it. This one had weight, the weight of something being said for the first time that had been true for a very long time. Alexander sat with it. He did not rush to respond, which was new. The Alexander she had married responded quickly, with the confident ease of a man who always had an available position on everything. This Alexander sat with the silence and let it be what it was. "Then, were you afraid of me?" he said. She considered. "Not of you," she said. "Of your judgment. Of being seen clearly and found insufficient. Of being—" She paused. "My mother was extraordinary, and my father didn't notice. Not fully. And I grew up watching that and learning from it, but I learned the wrong lesson. I learned how to be extraordinary in ways that didn't get noticed, rather than learning how to require being noticed." "Your mother," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I never thought about your mother when I thought about you," he said. "I should have. I should have asked more about her." "There were a great many things you should have asked more about," she said. Without rancor, just clearly. "Yes," he said, "there were." The twist came at 2 in the afternoon. She had not planned on a twist. She had planned on a contained, honest, difficult conversation that ended with, she wasn't sure what it ended with, but something clarified. Something settled. Not resolution, not necessarily, but the particular clarity that comes after you have finally said the true things in the correct words. What came instead was Caroline at the study door with the expression she had never used before, which Elizabeth read immediately as something has happened, and I don't know what category to put it in. "I'm sorry to interrupt, ma'am," Caroline said. "What is it?" There's a man here. From the county." Caroline looked at Alexander briefly, then back at Elizabeth. "He says he needs to speak to Mr. Whitmore. He says it can't wait." Elizabeth looked at Alexander. Alexander's face changed, not dramatically, not into alarm, but into the particular stillness of a man who is trying to determine from very little information whether the thing arriving is the thing he has been half expecting, or something else entirely. "Send him in," Elizabeth said. She looked at Alexander. "Unless you'd prefer—" "No," he said. "Here is fine." He said it in a way that meant, "I am not going anywhere. Whatever this is, I am not leaving this room." The man from the county was named Mr. Foster. He was a clerk, not a senior official. A clerk, the kind of man sent on errands that required physical delivery rather than institutional wait. He was nervous in the way that clerks were nervous when they had been given an errand by someone more powerful than themselves, and had arrived to find that the errand was more complicated than the instructions had anticipated. He looked at Elizabeth. He looked at Alexander. He looked at Elizabeth again. "Mr. Whitmore," he said to Alexander, "I have been sent by the county magistrate's office. There has been a development in the matter of the estate fraud." Alexander said very calmly, "What development?" The clerk looked at his papers. "The man you identified, the one taken into custody last week, he has provided additional information as part of his arrangement with the magistrate's office." He paused. He was building to something. "He has named a second party, someone who was working in coordination with him." He looked at his papers again. "The second party, as the information he provided suggests, the coordination went back further than the original investigation determined. Approximately 14 months. 14 months, Alexander said. "Yes, sir." Elizabeth was doing arithmetic in her head. The investigation had determined 10 months. The new information pushed it to 14, which meant it had begun 4 months before Alexander had hired the man who had been caught. Which meant the man who was caught, she said, was not the original architect. The clerk looked at her. "He came into the scheme already in progress," she said. "He didn't design it. He joined it." The clerk looked at his papers. "That is, yes, ma'am, that is consistent with what has been disclosed." "Who designed it?" Alexander said. The clerk looked deeply uncomfortable. He looked at his papers with the expression of a man who would very much like the papers to contain an answer to the question of how to handle this room. "The second party," he said carefully, "is an individual known to the Whitmore family. The magistrate thought it appropriate to inform you in person rather than have you discover it through other channels." "Who?" Alexander said. The clerk said the name. The name was not a stranger's. It was his cousin's, James Whitmore, who had been in the Grand Hall on July 14th, who had stood among the 20 witnesses, who had shaken Alexander's hand afterward and said quietly enough that it hadn't been a public statement, something about fresh starts and better prospects. who had been for 14 months systematically extracting money from the Whitmore estate through a scheme that had required someone with intimate family knowledge to construct. The silence in the room was complete and specific. The silence of two people absorbing information that reorganized a significant portion of what they thought they understood. Alexander said nothing for a long time. Then James, "It was just the name," said in a voice that was very flat, which Elizabeth recognized as what Alexander's voice did when an emotion was too large for inflection, when feeling it fully would require setting down control he needed to maintain. "Yes, sir," the clerk said. He was clearly relieved to be confirming rather than delivering further shocks. "When?" Alexander said. "The magistrate would like to see you tomorrow morning," the clerk said. "There are formal statements to be taken. The second party has been detained." "I'll be there," Alexander said. The clerk left with the speed of a man who has completed a difficult errand and has no desire to extend his presence. The room was very quiet. Elizabeth looked at Alexander. He was sitting very still with his hands flat on his knees, the same gesture she made herself. She noticed again when she needed to feel something solid. She watched him process it. Watched the stillness contain whatever was happening underneath it. "James," he said again. "Alexander. He was in the room," he said. "On July 14th. He was one of the 20. He looked at her. While I was—" He stopped. "While I was ending my marriage, my cousin was standing as a witness to it. Having spent 14 months stealing from the family he was watching me defend the reputation of." She said nothing. "He came to me in March," Alexander said, when I was already considering. "He encouraged me. He said that you were unsuited, that the marriage was pulling the estate's reputation in the wrong direction." He looked at his hands. "I didn't think about why he might want me distracted. I didn't think about what it would benefit him if I was preoccupied with a domestic matter instead of the accounts." He looked up. "He suggested the new man of business. Did you know that the man who was caught?" James suggested him. Elizabeth was very still. "I didn't know that specifically," she said. "I knew the man had connections that weren't consistent with a legitimate recommendation." She paused. "I didn't know whose recommendation he came from." Alexander looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. "He used my marriage," he said. "He used the difficulty in my marriage, my difficulty, the difficulty I created to create a window for the theft. He made sure I was looking the wrong direction." He paused. "And you in the middle of all of it on the day I—" He stopped. His voice was not steady. "You were looking the right direction." "I'm always looking," she said quietly. "That's the problem." He shook his head. "That's not the problem," he said. "That was never the problem." He pressed his hands harder against his knees. "I made it the problem. I took the most valuable thing in my house, and I turned it into an inconvenience. And while I was doing that, someone was using my blindness to rob me." He paused. "You saw both, the fraud and the blindness. You addressed the fraud. You couldn't address the blindness because I wouldn't let you." She said, "No." He looked at her. "Don't make this a story about your blindness," she said. "That's still making it about you." She held his gaze. "I made choices too. I chose to manage around you rather than require you to see me. That was my choice, and I'm responsible for it. Not because you were right about the marriage, you weren't, but because I participated in the construction of a dynamic that served neither of us." She paused. "We were both wrong. In different ways for different reasons with different costs. But both." He looked at her. Then he said very quietly, "How are you this fair to me?" She thought about that. "I'm not being fair to you," she said. "I'm being accurate. Those aren't the same thing." He almost laughed. It was a very small sound, not joyful, but real, the sound of genuine reaction rather than performed reaction. "No," he said. "They're not." He came back on Friday, and on the following Wednesday, and on the Saturday after that, each time with no stated purpose beyond the conversation that had begun on that October Wednesday, and did not seem to have a natural conclusion, or rather, whose natural conclusion was not going to be reached in a single visit, or 3 visits, or possibly a year of visits, because what was being worked through was not a single misunderstanding, but the accumulated weight of a marriage constructed on insufficient foundations, and the question of what if anything could be built on what remained. Elizabeth received each visit the same way she had received the first in her study at her desk, her life arranged around her without adjustment. She did not perform welcome. She did not perform distance. She was simply there doing what she did, and he arrived and sat in the chair, and they talked. She noticed things about these visits. She noticed that he arrived earlier each time. The first visit had been mid-morning. The second was before 9 o'clock. The third was as she was finishing her morning account review before she had cleared her desk. He was not, she understood, giving her time to prepare for him. He was coming before she could construct a version of herself for his arrival. He was looking for her, the real her, the one who was already in the room. She noticed that he started asking about the estate work. Not politely, not in the performative way of a man making conversation about a woman's domestic concerns. He asked the way he asked about things he was genuinely interested in. Specific questions, follow-up questions, questions that showed he had thought about the previous answer and had arrived at the next question from that thinking. He was interested in what she was doing. That was new. On the fourth visit, he arrived to find her in the middle of a disagreement with a supplier, a man named Greer, who had been supplying feed to the Hargrove estate for 20 years, and had been doing so at a price that was 15% above the county average. Apparently on the theory that 20 years of loyalty from the estate translated into immunity from negotiation. Elizabeth had the Greer account spread on the desk and the county rate information beside it, and was in the middle of explaining with the calm precision she brought to all such conversations that she valued the 20-year relationship and intended to continue it, and that the relationship would be continued at the county average rate, and that this was not a negotiation about the rate, but an informing of the rate, and that Mr. Greer was welcome to consider his options, and return with a response by the following Tuesday. Mr. Greer was a broad man with the particular resistance of someone who had never had to take Elizabeth seriously before and was finding the experience disorienting. "Miss Hargrove," he said, "your grandfather." "My grandfather," Elizabeth said, "was generous with his loyalty in ways that I respect and do not intend to replicate beyond what the county market supports. The rate is the county average. Tuesday, please." Greer looked up, saw Alexander in the doorway, and did the visible recalculation of someone who has just noticed a factor they hadn't accounted for. Elizabeth looked at Alexander. Then she looked back at Greer. "Mr. Greer," she said, "Mr. Whitmore is here to see me. I'd appreciate your answer by Tuesday." Greer left. Alexander sat in the chair. "He was hoping I'd intervene," Alexander said. "Yes," she said. "Were you hoping I would?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "I was hoping you'd stay out of it." He nodded. 15% above market for 20 years, he said. "Roughly," she said. "I would have paid it," he said. "At the Whitmore estate. I would have received that account and paid it without checking the county rate." "I know," she said. "You checked it." "I check everything," she said. "That's the point. That's always been the point." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not doing this to show you something about yourself. I'm doing it because it's my estate, and it's what I do. But I'm not going to pretend you're not seeing it." "I'm not asking you to pretend," he said. "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The water rights matter," he said. "With the Miller family. Caldwell told me about it when I saw him last week." She looked at him. "You saw Caldwell. I had a question about estate law," he said with the careful neutrality of a man who has done something deliberate and is presenting it as something ordinary. "He mentioned you were converting the Miller arrangement into a formal instrument. He said the legal work was impressive." Caldwell had said that to Alexander. Deliberately. She would have a word with Caldwell, and she would not be annoyed at him because Caldwell was 71 years old and had known her since she was 12 and was apparently conducting a quiet parallel campaign in her interest. "The Miller arrangement had been informal for 14 years, she said. "Informal arrangements invite disputes." "Yes," Alexander said. "I know. I have an informal arrangement with the Henderson family regarding the creek boundary on my north property. I've been thinking about it." He paused. "I've been thinking about a great many things." He looked at her. Elizabeth. Something in the way he said her name was different from every other time he had said it in these visits. Not careful. Not precise. Something else. She looked at him, "I am not going to ask you to come back," he said. "I told you I wouldn't, and I meant it. What I did in that hall, what I built for 6 years, and what I destroyed in one afternoon. I am not going to present you with a request that asks you to set aside the cost of it as if it were a negotiating position." She waited. "I am going to tell you what I want," he said, "because I've spent 6 years not telling you what I actually wanted, and letting what I wanted make itself known through how I behaved, which was, as I now understand, a spectacular way to communicate nothing useful to anyone." He looked at her directly. "I want to know you. The actual you. The woman who is in this room right now, who checked the county rate and talked to Greer and locked the important letters with a brass key and wrote to Harrington on the day I—" He stopped. "I want to know her. I don't know what that looks like from here. I don't know what's possible and what isn't. I know what I want." She said nothing for a long moment. "That's honest," she said finally. "I'm trying to be honest," he said, comprehensively. "It's harder than I expected. I was under the impression I was an honest man." "You were an honest man about most things," she said. "You were not honest about what you saw and didn't see. That's a specific kind of dishonesty that is also the most common kind." "Yes," he said. "I know that now." She looked at him. She thought about what he had said. "I want to know you. Not I want you back. Not I want to repair what we had." He had specifically, deliberately chosen not to say those things, and had said this other thing instead, and she understood that the specificity was intentional, that he was offering her something different from a request to reverse July 14th. He was offering to start somewhere new. She said, "I'm not the woman you married." "No," he said, "I know. I was that woman already," she said. "I was always her, but now I live in my own house and run my own estate and make my own decisions without calibrating them against anyone else's expectations. That has clarified things in me." She paused. "I'm not willing to unclarify them." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I need you to understand that," she said. "Not as a statement I make and you agree to. Actually understand it, because agreeing to something and understanding it are very different, and you have spent 6 years demonstrating the difference between them." He received this without flinching. "I know," he said. "I know I have. I am asking for the opportunity to demonstrate the difference in the other direction." He paused. "Slowly, without a plan for how it ends. Just begin, if you're willing." She looked at him. She thought about beginnings. She had been good at beginnings her whole life. She had begun in July under circumstances designed to break her, and the beginning had produced 3 months of the most clarifying work she had ever done, and a life that was genuinely structurally her own. She thought about what it would mean to begin something with this man. Not what they had been. Something else. Something that started from where they actually were, from what he had actually seen, and what she was actually willing to be. She thought about her mother. She thought about her mother's beautiful, skilled, unnoticed labor, and her father's unaware comfort in it, and she thought, not that. Whatever this is not that. She thought about Thomas's letter. He is not well. She thought about Alexander sitting in this chair, 3 visits now, arriving earlier each time, looking for the woman who was already in the room before he arrived. Looking. Finally looking. She said, "Come on Thursday." He looked at her. "Come on Thursday," she said. "I'm meeting with the Miller family again to finalize the water rights instrument. You can read the document. If you have questions about the legal structure, ask them. If you have opinions, keep them, unless I ask." She held his gaze. "And then stay for dinner. And we will talk. Not about the marriage, not about July. Just talk." He was quiet for a moment. She watched something move across his face that she had never seen there before. Not relief exactly, not triumph. Something much simpler and more human than either of those things. He said, "Thursday." "Thursday," she said. He stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at her one more time. That finally looking that she had been asking for without knowing the right words for 6 years. Then he walked out, and Elizabeth Hargrove turned back to her desk and her accounts and the life that was entirely her own, and she felt for the first time since the carriage had pulled away from the Whitmore estate on the morning of July 15th the locked place in her chest, release something. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to know the key was turning. She picked up her pen. She had work to do, and the work as it had been since July was the ground she stood on when everything else was uncertain. Thursday came with the particular quality of a day that has been anticipated carefully and arrives anyway as itself, neither smaller nor larger than the anticipation, but simply real, with the weather it had, and the hour it started, and the particular sounds of Hargrove House in the early morning before the rest of the world arrived. Elizabeth was at her desk at 6. She had been at her desk at 6 every morning since July, but this morning she was aware of it differently. Aware that the morning had a shape that would change at some point when Alexander arrived, and that she had chosen that, and that choosing it meant something she was still in the process of understanding. The Miller document was ready. She had reviewed it twice. The previous evening had found 2 places where the language was imprecise, and corrected them. Had written a note to Caldwell about one remaining question regarding the county recording process. The document was, she believed, exactly what it needed to be: specific, comprehensive, and written in language that would be clear to the Miller family, without requiring a solicitor to interpret it for them, because Elizabeth had long believed that legal instruments written in language only lawyers could read served the lawyers more than the parties. Caroline brought her breakfast at 7 without being asked, which was Caroline's way of saying she understood the day had weight. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. "Will Mr. Whitmore be staying for dinner?" Caroline said. She said it in the careful, neutral voice of someone who has learned not to attach visible opinions to questions whose answers carry emotional significance. "Yes," Elizabeth said. Caroline said yes, ma'am, and went to speak to the kitchen. Elizabeth ate her breakfast and did not think about Alexander, because thinking about Alexander before he arrived was not useful, and she had become very good at not doing things that were not useful. She thought about the Miller document instead. The Millers arrived at 9. Robert Miller, the father, 63, with the deliberate manner of a man who had built everything he had through careful patient work and trusted careful patient work. Above all other methods, came with his son David and David's wife, whose name was Catherine, and who had said at their last meeting exactly 4 words that demonstrated more legal understanding than anyone else in the room. What does perpetual mean here? Elizabeth liked Catherine Miller very much. They sat at the table in the study. Elizabeth walked them through the document section by section in the direct way she had developed over months of estate meetings. Not talking down, not performing expertise, simply explaining what each part said and why it said it that way and what it protected and for whom. Robert Miller listened with the focused attention of a man receiving information he intends to remember. David Miller asked practical questions about the implementation. Catherine Miller asked 3 questions that went directly to the most significant provisions in the document, which confirmed Elizabeth's original assessment of her. At 10:15, Alexander knocked. Caroline showed him in. He came to the doorway of the study, took in the room, the document spread on the table, the 3 Millers, Elizabeth, at the head of the table, and stopped. "I'm early," he said. "By 15 minutes, Elizabeth said. "Sit down. We're nearly finished." He sat in the chair against the wall, not at the table, correctly understanding that the table was not his, and he sat quietly while she completed the session with the Millers. She was aware of him watching, not intrusively, not with the quality of someone performing observation. He was watching the way he had begun to watch in the visits since October, with the focused, genuine attention of someone who has decided they want to understand something and is going about the understanding properly. He was watching her work. She finished the session. The Millers signed where they were to sign. Robert Miller shook her hand with the particular firmness of a man concluding something he was satisfied with and said, "Your grandfather was a good man, Miss Hargrove. You do him credit." David Miller said something practical about the recording timeline. Catherine Miller said quietly as she was leaving, "If you ever need a woman who can read a contract quickly, you know where I am." Elizabeth looked at her. "I'll remember that," she said. She meant it. When they were gone, she turned to Alexander. He was looking at her with the expression that had become over the past weeks, the expression she most associated with him, now that unguarded paying attention look that she had never seen in 6 years of marriage and had been seeing consistently since October. "The document," he said. "The water rights instrument." "Yes. Catherine Miller caught the perpetuity clause in your first draft," he said, "at the last meeting." Elizabeth looked at him. She had not told him that. "Caldwell mentioned it," he said. "He mentioned it with considerable admiration." "She has a good legal mind," Elizabeth said. "You recognized it immediately," he said. "In the first meeting." "Yes. Most people wouldn't have," he said. "Most people would have received her question and answered it and moved on. You saw what the question came from." "That's what you do when you're paying attention," she said. He received that. Received it fully, which meant he heard the second layer of it, the layer that was about more than Catherine Miller and did not deflect. "Yes," he said. "It is." They had the dinner she had promised. Caroline had arranged it in the small dining room, which was the dining room Elizabeth used when she was not expecting a formal occasion. The room that was hers, in the way that the grand dining room at the Whitmore estate had been the room of the institution of the Whitmore family. This room was where she ate when she was eating, rather than performing eating. She had not thought carefully about what it meant to bring Alexander into that room. She thought about it now when he sat across from her and Caroline served soup, and the room was exactly the quiet, unperformed room it always was. "This is different," he said. "From what?" she said. "From every dinner we had," he said, "in 6 years." She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." "What's different?" he said. He said it the way he had been saying things lately, genuinely asking, not rhetorically, not performing curiosity, but actually having it. "No audience," she said. "No performance requirements. No management of how things appear." She looked at him. "This is dinner. Not dinner as a social demonstration." He looked at the table. At the simple arrangement, the practical place settings, the soup, that was good soup without being an architectural statement about the Whitmore family's relationship to French cuisine. "I didn't know dinner could be like this," he said. "You knew," she said. "You just hadn't been in a position to have it." "Had I been?" he asked. "Before the marriage," she thought. "Perhaps when you were young," she said. "Before the estate became something to maintain rather than somewhere to live." He was quiet. "My mother used to eat in the kitchen sometimes," he said. "When my father was away, she'd bring me with her. The cook would tell stories." He stopped. "I hadn't thought about that in years." "What happened to those evenings?" she said. "I grew up," he said. "And growing up meant learning which things were appropriate for a Whitmore and which weren't." He looked at his soup. "My mother stopped going to the kitchen. I assumed she'd decided it wasn't appropriate. I wonder now if she just stopped being offered the choice." Elizabeth looked at him. He was doing the thing she had watched him do increasingly over the past weeks, reaching back into his own experience and looking at it from the recalibrated vantage point of what he now understood. Not to make himself the victim of it, not to excuse himself through it, just to understand how he had arrived at being the person who had made the choices he had made. "Your mother," she said. "Did she manage things she wasn't acknowledged for?" He was quiet for a long time. "I think she probably did," he said. "I think I probably didn't see it." He looked at her. "I think I learned from watching my father not to see it." "Yes," she said. "And I learned from watching my mother to do it in ways that weren't visible." She held his gaze. "We were both educated into a pattern that served neither of us." "And we enacted it perfectly," he said. "Perfectly," she agreed. They ate in silence for a moment. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have said something true and are letting it settle before they say the next thing. Then Alexander said, "What would it have looked like if we'd done it differently from the beginning?" She thought about this. It was a strange question, the kind of question that was also a kind of grief, because any honest answer to it contained the implicit acknowledgement of what hadn't happened. But she answered it honestly because that was the commitment of this table, of this room, of whatever they were building in these visits. "I would have told you directly about the accounts," she said. "Not through suggestion, not through careful maneuvering, directly." "Alexander, I've noticed an irregularity and I'd like to look into it." She paused. "And you would have had to decide in that moment whether to receive that as a woman overstepping or as a person you trusted with important information." "And if I'd chosen wrong," he said. "Then we would have had an argument," she said. "A real one. And after the argument, you would have known something true about me, and I would have known something true about you, and we would have had to decide what to do with it." She paused. "We never had that argument. We never had any of the real arguments. We managed around them so skillfully that they never happened, and so we never learned anything from them, and so we arrived at July not knowing each other at all." He said, "I want to have the real arguments." She looked at him. "Going forward," he said, "whatever form going forward takes, I want the real arguments and the real dinners and the real conversations. I don't want to manage around the difficult parts." He paused. "I understand that's a thing I'm saying, rather than a thing I've demonstrated. I understand the demonstration is what matters." "Yes," she said. "It is. I'm willing to demonstrate it for as long as it takes," he said, "for whatever that's worth." She looked at him across the table. This man she had loved for 6 years, without being seen, who was sitting in her dining room in her house, telling her he was willing to demonstrate something for as long as it took. "It's worth something," she said. Ting. The letter from Margaret arrived the following week, and it was the kind of letter Margaret wrote when she had been thinking about something carefully and had decided the thinking was complete enough to put in writing. It was also the letter that changed the shape of everything. Elizabeth Margaret wrote, "I am writing with information that I believe you need both because you deserve it and because it affects decisions you may be in the process of making. I hope you'll receive it in the spirit of friendship in which it is offered. You should know that Alexander has been making changes at the Whitmore estate, not small ones. He dismissed 2 members of the household staff who had been recommended by James, this before James's arrest on his own initiative, because he had begun to look carefully at the staffing arrangements and found them inconsistent. He has also been reviewing the estate accounts himself daily, which is not something he has done in, I believe, in the entirety of our acquaintance with him. Thomas tells me he arrives at the estate office before 7 in the morning. He has also, and this is the part I most wanted you to know, spoken with Mr. Harrington about the possibility of making a formal acknowledgement in legal documented form of your contribution to the estate's preservation. Not financial restitution, which he understands you would refuse. A documented acknowledgement. On the record. With Mr. Harrington as witness. He has not told you this because he does not want it to appear as a gesture designed to influence your decisions. He wanted to do it regardless of what you decide. He wanted it to exist whether or not you ever knew it existed. I am telling you because I believe you should know. Your friend, Margaret Elizabeth, read the letter. She read it again. She set it down on the desk and looked at the wall for a long time. A documented acknowledgement. On the record. With Harrington as witness. Not to influence her. Not as a negotiating position. Simply to put on record permanently what she had done and who she was. He wanted it to exist whether or not she ever knew. She thought about 6 years of invisible, unacknowledged work. She thought about the household accounts and the contract negotiations and the careful oblique letters and the 2 hours in the estate office on July 14th. She thought about all the things she had done that had existed without record, without acknowledgement, in the space of their marriage, where her competence had been present and her credit had not. He was putting it on record, not because he had to, not because she had asked, because it was true and it deserved to be documented. She sat with that for a very long time. Then she stood up and went to find Caroline. "I need to send a message to Mr. Whitmore," she said. Caroline did not comment on the timing or the expression on her face. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "What shall it say?" Elizabeth thought for a moment. "Tell him I'd like to see him today," she said. If he's able. He was able. He arrived at 2 o'clock, which meant he had come immediately on receiving the message which told her he had been waiting for it. She met him in the study. She had Margaret's letter on the desk, but she didn't reference it directly because the question she needed to ask didn't require the letter. "The documented acknowledgement," she said, "with Harrington." He went very still. "Margaret told me," she said before he could say anything. I'm not raising it because I'm angry that she told me. I'm raising it because I want to ask you something about it directly." "Ask," he said. "Why?" she said. "Not why as a challenge. Why as a genuine question. You could have done it quietly as you planned. It would have existed on the record without my knowing. Why did you want it to exist?" He looked at her. He was not composing an answer. She could see the difference now, after weeks of watching him, between the Alexander who composed and the Alexander who actually thought. This was the second one. "Because the truth has a place," he said finally. "What you did, what you were, it happened. It was real. The record of our marriage as it currently exists doesn't reflect it. And He stopped. "I cannot go back and give you the 6 years. I cannot unsign the paper or unspeak what I said in the hall. But I can make certain that what is true is somewhere true on paper, that it exists outside of our memories where it might be distorted by feeling or time." He paused. "You deserve to exist on the record." She looked at him. "You deserve to exist on the record as who you are," he said. "Not as a failed wife, not as someone who left. As the woman who identified a fraud against this family and addressed it at cost to herself and asked for nothing in return." He held her gaze. "That is who you are. That should be written down somewhere that can be found." The room was very quiet. Elizabeth felt the locked place in her chest release the rest of what it had been holding. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical emotion of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and finally receives it. Quietly, the way things released when they were ready, when enough had happened around them to make the release possible. She was not going to cry. She cried. Just for a moment. Just enough to be true and then be done. 2 or 3 real tears, and then she pressed her hand against her face the way she had pressed it against her knee in October, and she was still again. Alexander did not speak. He did not move toward her. He did not manage the moment. He sat in the chair and let her have it, which was, she thought through the clarity of it, the most correct thing he had done in her presence. "Thank you," she said when she was done. "Don't thank me," he said. "It's what should have been true all along." "I know," she said, "but it wasn't. And now it is. And the difference between those two things is significant, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't." He nodded. She looked at him. She thought about what she was going to say. She had been thinking about it since Margaret's letter, since this morning, since the moment she had sent for him. She had thought about it carefully, which was her way. She did not make significant statements without having thought carefully about them, because significant statements once made could not be unmade, and she had spent enough of her life managing the aftermath of unmade things. She was ready. "I'm not coming back to the Whitmore estate," she said. He nodded. He had known that. "Hargrove House is mine," she said. "My name, my management, my decisions. That doesn't change regardless of anything else." "I know," he said. "And I am not. I am not the same woman who arrived at your house 6 years ago," she said. "I cannot be managed around. I cannot be silenced through the particular politeness that isn't politeness. I will not hide what I see to protect your comfort." She held his gaze. "If you want to know me, the actual me, you need to understand that who I actually am is going to be consistently, continuously different from what you expected a Whitmore wife to be." "I know," he said. "Do you?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because knowing it in October and knowing it in practice are different things. I will catch irregularities in your accounts and tell you directly. I will disagree with your solicitor when your solicitor is wrong. I will have opinions about things you have traditionally considered outside the scope of a woman's concern, and I will not soften those opinions into suggestions when they need to be statements. She paused. I will be exactly who I am. All of it. Without management. He looked at her for a long time. Good, he said. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. I don't want the managed version. I never benefited from the managed version, even when I thought I preferred it. He held her gaze. I want the woman who told Greer the rate was the county average, and it wasn't a negotiation. I want the woman who locked the important letters in the brass-keyed drawer. I want the woman who spent 2 hours in my estate office on the worst afternoon of her life doing the right thing because it was the right thing. He paused. That is who I want to know. I understand it's a larger undertaking than I have previously demonstrated I was capable of. I understand the demonstration is what counts. He paused once more. But that is what I want. The room held very still. Elizabeth looked at the man across from her. Not the man she had married. Not the man she had been managing around, but this man, the one in the chair who had been arriving earlier each visit and asking real questions and sitting against the wall in the right chair during the Miller meeting and crying she suspected in private in ways that Thomas reported as not well. The man who had put her on the record because it was true and truth deserved to be documented. She said, "Come on Sunday." He looked at her. "For dinner again," she said. "And bring the Henderson property documents, the creek boundary arrangement. If it's been informal for any significant time, it needs to be formalized, and you'll want someone who knows how to read a water rights instrument to look at it." She held his gaze. "I'll look at it." Something crossed his face that she had not seen since before the marriage began, since the early months when they had been new to each other and the performance of what they were supposed to be had not yet fully replaced the reality of what they were. Something that was simply him responding to simply her. He said Sunday. Sunday, she said. He stood. He looked at her one more time. The looking, the real looking, the kind she had been asking for in every indirect, careful managed way for 6 years, and was now receiving directly and completely. Then he left. And Elizabeth Hargrove sat in her study, in her house, and felt the shape of what was being built, not rebuilt, not restored, not repaired, but built new on honest foundations, in a shape that neither of them had managed in 6 years of trying to fit themselves into someone else's idea of what the shape should be. She opened the drawer with the brass key. She took out the Harrington letter, the first one, the one that confirmed the fraud, the one she had read standing up on July 22nd. She read it one more time. Then she put it back in the drawer. But this time, she did not lock it. The year that followed was not a love story in the way that the word was commonly used in Virginia drawing rooms in 1818. There were no grand gestures performed for audiences. There were no moments of theatrical declaration designed to be remembered and recounted. There was no reversal that undid July 14th, or gave back 6 years, or transformed Alexander Whitmore into a man who had always known how to see. What there was Sundays. And then Thursdays as well, and eventually certain Wednesdays, and then the occasional morning when Alexander arrived before his stated time and found Elizabeth in the middle of something, and sat against the wall in the right chair, and waited until she was finished. What there was argument. Real argument of the kind they had never had about the Henderson boundary and the county law, about the appropriate interest rate on an extended tenant lease, about the best approach to a supply negotiation with a man who had been exploiting a long-standing relationship. Arguments that were complete where both of them said what they actually thought, and neither of them softened it for the other's comfort. And both of them sometimes changed their positions because the other person had made a point that was correct, which was the function of an argument rather than the exception to it. She was right more often than he was. He learned to say so directly. She learned that the learning was genuine, which took several months and was worth the wait. What there was the documented acknowledgement. Mr. Harrington filed it in the first week of November. She had not asked to see it. He sent her a copy anyway, with a brief note in his less formal hand. "For your records, Miss Hargrove, you should have it." She read it once and put it in the drawer. Not locked, just there in the place where she kept things that were hers. What there was the conversation with Caroline, who asked in the spring of 1818 whether Miss Hargrove would be requiring a larger household staff, and Elizabeth looked at her and understood the question behind the question. "Not yet," she said. Caroline nodded in the way she always nodded when she understood something completely. "But possibly," Elizabeth said. Caroline did not smile. She was too professional to smile at that. But her eyes did something. What there was eventually was a morning in late spring when Alexander arrived and did not knock. She had told him in March not to knock, that if he was coming, he should come, and he had initially continued to knock, and then had one morning not knocked, and she had heard the door and had not looked up from the document she was reading, until she heard him sit in the chair, at which point she said, "Good morning," and he said, "Good morning," and they were both, she thought, exactly where they were. What there was the Miller family who came to update the water rights instrument in April, and brought Catherine Miller, who shook Elizabeth's hand and shook Alexander's hand, and said, looking between them with the direct assessment of a woman who read things clearly, "I see you're both still working," and said nothing else and did not need to. What there was Caldwell, who told Elizabeth in June that Hargrove House had under her management increased its annual yield by 23% over the previous year, and that the tenant relationships were the strongest he had seen in the estate's recent history, and that he was considering retirement, and would she like to discuss the appropriate management of the transition. What there was a Sunday in July, 1 year exactly from the date the carriage had pulled away from the Whitmore estate when Alexander arrived and sat and looked at her and said, "A year." "Yes," she said. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "Are you all right? Today specifically." She thought about today specifically. She thought about the gray dress and the signed paper and the carriage window and the road to Hargrove House and Caroline with her small trunk saying, "I assumed I was coming, ma'am." She thought about the early mornings and the account books and Dunmore and Greer and the Millers and Caldwell and Thomas's letters and Harrington's careful paragraphs and Margaret's friendship and the brass-keyed drawer. She thought about what she had built in a year. "I'm better than all right," she said. He looked at her. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "So am I," he said. He said it quietly, without performance, in the voice he used for things that were simply true. "For the first time in longer than I can accurately identify." He paused. "I'm exactly where I should be." She held his gaze. And this was the thing. The thing that was not in any of the drawing-room retellings of love stories, not in the letters between women about what marriage should look like, not in the advice that mothers gave daughters, or that daughters watched mothers perform. The thing that was only available when two people stripped away every managed version of themselves and showed up imperfect and honest, and late, sometimes very late, to the recognition of who the other person actually was. Elizabeth Hargrove, who had spent 6 years invisible in a marriage and 1 year building something entirely her own, looked at the man across from her, the man who had been finding his way to her slowly and imperfectly, and with the honest labor of someone who had finally understood what looking required, and she knew something that she had not known how to know before. Being seen was not something that happened to you. It was something that was built in Sundays and arguments and creek boundary documents and brass-keyed drawers, and 3 hours of real conversation and small dining rooms without audiences, and the particular decision made repeatedly and deliberately to be exactly who you were and require the same of the person across from you. It was not romantic in the drawing-room sense. It was something much better than that. It was real. And Elizabeth Hargrove, who had always known how to begin, who had begun in the worst possible circumstances and had built something extraordinary from the beginning, who had protected what was true, even when truth cost her everything, who had walked out of a grand hall with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands still, and her name signed in her own right. Elizabeth Hargrove looked across the table at the man who had finally learned to see her and chose him again, not because the world expected it, not because reputation required it, not because she needed him or because he needed her, but because they had arrived separately and together at the truth of each other, and the truth was something she was willing to build a life on. She had always been willing to build. She had simply been waiting for someone willing to look at what she was building. He was looking now, and that finally completely on her own terms and no one else's was enough.